Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. We will now continue with Part 2, Chapter 33. It was a fascinating idea that insanity was the result of an out-of-tune mind crossing into a dissonant world. Will also wondered what Jeremy meant by toxic beings, and how they differed from other supernatural entities. But the question that had sparked this admittedly interesting discussion, namely, why hadn't Iris appeared to Will in the waking world, seemed to have gotten lost in the course of it. What species of being is Iris? Will asked him, attempting to steer the conversation back to the subject of his guardian angel. She's not toxic, is she? No, Jeremy quickly answered. Quite the opposite. Then, if I understand correctly, said Will, Iris normally lives in another world, but her range of worlds is broader than ours and includes this one. Yes, he replied. She can enter this world by changing her frequency, just as you can enter it by changing yours. What about the waking world? Will asked. You said that she was with me there, so it must also be within her range. Yes, said Jeremy. Farther out, but well within it. Which brought them back to Will's original question. Then, why can't she appear to me there? He asked. Jeremy smiled and began nodding his head. Yes, he said quietly. Here we are again. Very good. But before Jeremy had a chance to continue, Will felt a wrinkle in his world. Hold on, he said, rising to his feet. Another guest? Jeremy inquired, looking unconcerned. Yes, he said, now detecting assent. But it's okay. It's Charlotte. Where? Asked Emily. In town? No, said Will. He led her across the balcony to the railing that faced westward, and began scanning the area below him. There, he said, pointing to a figure standing on the grass near the edge of the canyon. Hello, Emily called down to her friend. Charlotte turned around and looked behind her. Up here, cried Emily, now waving her arms above her head. Charlotte then spotted the couple and waved back. This is amazing, she shouted, opening both arms as if to embrace all that she saw in front of her. Emily turned to Will and kissed him on the cheek. I'll be right back, she said. She then took a step back from the railing, put her arms at her side, and relaxed her body, apparently intending to skip down to greet Charlotte. But as her eyes began to droop, they suddenly widened. Wait a minute, she said. With a mischievous giggle, Emily stepped forward, looked down at Charlotte, and gave her another quick wave. This is going to freak her out, she muttered, boosting herself up onto the sturdy balustrade. What are you doing? Said Will, standing ready to grab her should she slip and fall. She put her hand on his shoulder to steady herself and carefully stood up on the railing. Watch, she said. Then, letting go of him, Emily raised her arms and dove headfirst into the abyss. Will leaned forward and saw his beloved plummet toward the river, But after dropping at full speed for only a few dozen feet, Emily quickly lost weight and slowed her descent until she was all but hovering. Then, spreading her arms like wings, she began to spin, turning slow, graceful somersaults in the air. It was a lovely show, an aerial ballet. But without Will's help, even in her near weightless state, she couldn't make it over to the bank where Charlotte stood. He considered providing a breeze to push her in that direction, but decided against intervening unless she asked. Perhaps she had other plans. As he watched, wondering what Emily had in mind, her solid body began losing its cohesion, becoming a swirling cloud of iridescent dust, continuing the dance as it slowly faded away. A moment later, he saw her materialize within a few feet of Charlotte. Once the girls had embraced, Emily looked up and waved at Will, who smiled, put his hand to his mouth, and blew her a kiss. He then turned and walked back to join Jeremy, sighing as he sat again. It seemed the fates were set against his question ever being answered. Jeremy must have sensed his frustration, for he looked up from the ground, smiled, and said sympathetically, "Our friend seems to have impeccable timing these days." "Charlotte? Yes, perfect," said Will, managing a smile. "By the way, have you had a chance to talk to her since we saw you?" "No," said Jeremy. "But I have given some thought to Lily and your curious relationship with her." "Any theories?" Will asked. "Perhaps," he replied. But before Jeremy could say anything more, Will noticed a mist forming in the center of the balcony. "Ah, here they are," said Jeremy, standing up straight as the two young women, hand in hand and smiling, made their appearance. "How are my two favorite men?" said Charlotte, greeting them. "Pleased to be so," Jeremy replied, adding, "Are we not, Will?" Charlotte smiled, then looked at Will, awaiting his response. "Of course," he answered. "This place," she said, looking around her, "the whole thing, the waterfall, the canyon, this castle, it's marvelous, Will." "Thank you," he said. "I'm glad you were able to find us." "It wasn't hard with all three of you here," she replied. "Sorry if I'm interrupting. No news. I just wanted to see how you were doing. If you're in the middle of something." Emily glanced at Will, who wasn't sure how to reply. "Tell you what," said Emily. "Why don't you two finish your discussion while I give Charlotte a tour of the place?" Will smiled. She was a treasure. "Okay," he said. "Please don't go too far." "Don't worry," she assured him. "We won't be long." And that concludes part 2, chapter 33. We will return immediately to finish the chapter.